Now we'll look at the three ligaments that run the length of the cervical spine, starting with the nuchal ligament. Here's the nuchal ligament, also called the ligamentum nuchae. It's a sheet of strong fibrous tissue that extends from the spinous process of the first thoracic vertebra to the external occipital protuberance. The nuchal ligament limits forward flexion of the head and the cervical spine. It also serves as the attachment for some major muscles. Next we'll go round to the front to see the anterior longitudinal ligament. This broad band is the anterior longitudinal ligament. It runs the whole length of the vertebral column, connecting the fronts of the vertebral bodies. It ends up here, at this tubercle on the arch of the atlas. The anterior longitudinal ligament is not as impressive in the neck as it is lower down. In the neck, the ligament that's impressive is the posterior longitudinal ligament, which runs down the backs of the vertebral bodies inside the vertebral canal. To see the posterior longitudinal ligament, we'll remove the arches of the vertebrae and also the back of the skull along this line. The spinal cord and the brain have been removed, together with the covering layer of dura. Here's the base of the occiput. Here's the foramen magnum. Here are the divided vertebral arches. This is the posterior longitudinal ligament. It's much broader and thicker here in the neck than it is lower down the spine. The highest part of this ligament goes by a different name. It's called the tectorial membrane. To get a different view of it, we'll look at a specimen that's been divided in the midline. Here's the foramen magnum. Here's the anterior arch of the atlas. Here's the odontoid process. Here's the tectorial membrane. It's attached to the base of the occiput and to the body of the axis. Continuing as the posterior longitudinal ligament, it's attached to the backs of the vertebral bodies all the way down the spine. Now we'll look at the ligaments which hold the odontoid process in place, making it the stable pivot round which rotation of the head occurs. We'll see the transverse ligament of the atlas, the cruciform ligament, which the transverse ligament is part of, and the alar ligaments. To see them, we'll go back to the previous rear view and remove the tectorial membrane. Directly beneath the tectorial membrane is this strong and important ligament, the transverse ligament of the atlas. The transverse ligament is attached on each side to these two tubercles on the atlas. The transverse ligament prevents the odontoid process from being displaced backwards. A slender ligament, the superior band, runs upward from the transverse ligament to the base of the occiput. Another one, the inferior band, runs downward to the body of the axis. These, along with the transverse ligament of the atlas, are referred to collectively as the cruciform ligament. We'll remove all of the cruciform ligament to see the odontoid process and the alar ligaments. Here's the odontoid process. Here are the massive alar ligaments. They pass from here on the odontoid process to here on the inside of the occipital condyles. The alar ligaments limit rotation of the head, especially in lateral flexion. Here's the side view again. Here's the tectorial membrane. Here in front of it is the divided transverse ligament of the atlas. It's quite an impressive structure. Lastly, we'll look at the ligaments that connect the vertebral arches. The arches of the regular cervical vertebrae are held together by strips of yellow fiber cartilage, known collectively as the ligamentum flavum. The arches of the axis and the atlas and the edges of the foramen magnum are held together by these loose and flexible sleeves of fibrous tissue, the atlanto-occipital and atlanto-axial ligaments. We've looked at a lot of anatomy already. Before we move on to look at the muscles, let's review what we've seen of the bones, joints and ligaments of this very fundamental part of the head and neck. Here's the occipital bone and the temporal bone. Here are the basal part and the squamous part of the occipital bone. The foramen magnum, the occipital condyles, the external occipital protuberance, the superior and inferior nuchal lines. On the temporal bone, here's the petrous part and the squamous part. Here are the mastoid process, the zygomatic arch, and the surface for the temporomandibular joint. Here's the external auditory meatus and the styloid process. The stylomastoid foramen, the carotid canal, the jugular foramen, and the hypoglossal canal. On a typical cervical vertebra, here's the body, the neural arch, the vertebral foramen, the spinous process, the transverse processes, the articular surfaces, and the articular pillar. On the atlas vertebra, here's the anterior arch, the posterior arch, and the lateral bodies. On the axis vertebra, here's the odontoid process. Here are the intervertebral joints and the intervertebral discs. Here are the atlanto-occipital and atlanto-axial joints. Here's the nuchal ligament, the anterior longitudinal ligament, the posterior longitudinal ligament, and the tectorial membrane. Here's the cruciform ligament, consisting of the transverse ligament of the atlas, the superior band, and the inferior band. And here are the two alar ligaments.